Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. There are many things that excite me in Chopin's music. One of the ones that intrigue me the most is how Chopin uses careful mathematical proportions in the way he structured phrases, in particular when organizing what I call metric foreshortening. I do intend to share some of the most interesting instances in future videos, and so the present video is a small example of what may eventually become a few dedicated to foreshortening. What do I mean by foreshortening? Foreshortening is a compositional device whereby a specific number of measures or beats is progressively reduced according to an exponential ratio. For example, if a passage is structured in 8-measure groups, we may notice how the writing switches to 4-measure units, and probably eventually to 2-measure groups. Likewise, 4-measure groups may switch to 2-measure units, then 1-measure units. This compositional strategy is normally used to build tension as a climax approaches, for example, or to announce the return of a main section such as the recapitulation of a piece. On a smaller scale, this can also happen to the metric organization of beats within a passage. I'd like to use the first movement of Beethoven's Sonata in G major, Opus 14, number 2, a piece that a student played in his lesson just a few days ago, to illustrate two examples of foreshortening. The first is found at the end of the development. Let's listen to the section. Phrases become exponentially shorter, beginning with 1-measure groups, then half-measure units. To clarify, in this passage, each measure comprises 2 beats, so half a measure is 1 beat. The foreshortening continues to half a beat, in this case 1/8 note. It goes even further to individual 16th notes, a quarter of a beat, until the music stops. Then the accumulated tension is released and the recapitulation begins. Another relevant foreshortening in the same movement, this time including the staggering of motifs, is presented at the onset of the development. Two-measure units turn into 1-measure units, and eventually an exchange between the two hands outlines a reduction of the metric system into half measures because of the staggering that occurs between the two voices. Now let's look at the work by Chopin that is the focus of this video, the Prelude in F-sharp major from the 24 Preludes, Opus 28. Chopin closes the first phrase by modulating to the dominant, C-sharp major. As the harmony arrives through C-sharp major, the left hand introduces a brief solo reminiscent perhaps of a cello line. The overall attitude in playing this moment in the piece is to observe the beats, the bar lines, and the grouping that is found in the music. In other words, pianists tend to look at the stemming presented by the conventional organization of the writing. In the case of this prelude, two groups of 6/8 notes per measure, and tend to stress the first note of each group to guarantee a sense of where the beats are, so to speak. I'm not implying that all pianists place strong accents at the beginning of each group of 6 notes in this passage, because in fact, no pianist in the 10 or so recordings that I randomly selected and listened to actually does. But that tends to be the general approach in playing patterned writing, sometimes at the expenses of motivic or melodic clarity. Beyond the linear approach that most pianists take in the left-hand eighth notes in this passage, how is the writing organized? This is a wonderful example of foreshortening as well as metric displacement. The left hand shows a pattern delineated as follows. There are 3 4-note groups. And after these groups, the writing changes to conform to what seems a 2-note group, and there are 2 such groups. We are then left with 1 note to finish measure 8. To summarize, there are 3 groups of 4 notes, 2 groups of 2 notes, and 1 group of 1 note. An exponential diminution of the number of notes per group, and a progressive decrease in number of groups. We also notice that the first group of 4 does not begin from a strong beat, but from the second eighth note of a group, which of course increases the sense of metric disorientation. Where did Chopin learn this compositional strategy? While in Warsaw, Chopin became well acquainted with Beethoven's music. He also lived in Vienna for 11 months between 1830 and 1831, where Beethoven, who had died 3 years prior to Chopin's stay, was considered some sort of mythological figure. It is in Vienna that Chopin perhaps became acquainted with Beethoven's Sonata in C minor, opus 111, whose coda in the first movement we find quite deliberately evoked in the coda of the so-called revolutionary etude. But let's return to foreshortenings, which were certainly not unusual in Beethoven. Do we even notice them in the music we play? The truth is that we are not always actively invested in analyzing how a composer operates. Noticing these compositional strategies may also change the way we understand the organization of phrases, which in turn affects our interpretations, I believe, in unexpected ways. The following is an important point to make. More often than not, Pianists don't notice these displacements and groupings, such as the one that we observed in Beethoven's sonata and in Chopin's Prelude. Or if they do, very often they still enforce the overall sense of metric stability deliberately, without seconding the shape of groups cast against the grain of the beats. Our tendency is to follow the prescribed structure visually imposed by bar lines and stemmed groups, and only when the deviations from the regular meter appear obvious in print do we actually make a conscious effort to determine their meaning. How many passages conceal absolutely wonderful metric displacements and foreshortenings that simply elude us?